This Sunday will mark the one-year anniversary of the beginning of the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And a year on, that disaster continues to devastate the people and the nation of Japan. Towns and cities within miles of the Fukushima plant are still covered in a fine layer of radioactive dust and have been turned into a nuclear wasteland devoid of life. Those lucky enough to have survived the earthquake and tsunami are now battling radiation poisoning and the probability of cancer and birth defects. As hundreds of thousands of people across the world prepare to commemorate the tragedy over the course of the next month, we need to ask ourselves, is nuclear power really worth enduring such a horrible and deadly disaster? Will there ever be a way to make nuclear power a safe form of energy? Or do we need to move away from it altogether? Tonight we have a special edition of Conversations with Great Minds featuring Stephanie Cooke. Stephanie is one of the world's top reporters and authors on the issue of nuclear energy and the use and history of nuclear weapons, and is a real industry insider. Her articles on nuclear topics have appeared in a variety of publications, including Reader's Digest, the International Herald Tribune, and GQ magazine. Stephanie first began her reporting career in 1977 at the Associated Press, and later moved to London, where she covered the Chernobyl disaster for Business Week. She returned to the United States in 2004 to complete her most recent book, In Mortal Hands, a cautionary history of the nuclear age. Currently, Stephanie is the editor of Nuclear Intelligence Weekly, part of the Energy Intelligence Group. Stephanie, brilliant book, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have us with you. I'm curious, just at a personal level, what sparked your interest in nuclear issues that took you to the point where you've become one of the experts around the world on this, at least from a repertorial point of view?
Well, if I go way back to when I started in 1980, I was at a conference in Mexico City on nonproliferation when I hardly understood the meaning of the word, let alone being able to pronounce it. And I met a Frenchman called Bertrand Goldschmidt, who was one of the distinguished guests, surrounded by acolytes, and he invited me to sit next to him at lunch, much to the chagrin of all the people that surrounded him, because I was sort of a little nobody. But I asked him, you know, thinking, what should I ask this man? I said, well, how did you get into this business? And he said, I separated radium isotopes for Marie Curie. And right away, my hair stood on end, because of course I had read about her and her discovery of radium and how she'd... And
her hands rotting off.
And her, well, as a child, you don't read this in children's biographies. She was a heroine of mine. Yeah. Not so much now, after I read grown-up biographies of her when I was researching my book. Yeah, she lost a child at 5 months, you know, a baby, and her daughter died of radiation poisoning, as did she. But you know, I thought, my goodness, you know, when you're growing up and you're reading about people like Marie Curie, you're thinking they're so far back in the past, and here you're sitting next to a man who actually knew her. Right. Because she only died in 1934. So that was one thing. And then the other was talking to a man at that conference. I took him aside and I said, by the way, mostly men were at these conferences. Sure. So I was sort of the odd person out, plus I was young then. So anyway, I said to this man, what's this all about? And he said, we're talking about the war and peace issues of our day. And I said, that's interesting. And so, you know, it sort of planted a seed, I think. I still was on a steep learning curve. I thought reactors were reactors and bombs were bombs. I didn't understand that there was a relationship between the two, and a very close one.
Well, what is that relationship?
Well, that's a whole separate area that I got into and that I learned as I went along, which is that the fuel cycle, which is starting from uranium in the ground to processing it and then putting it through an enrichment plant like the kind they have in Iran, is necessary to produce the fuel you need for a power reactor, but it's also the process that you go through in order to produce fuel for weapons. You can use an enrichment plant to produce weapons for a highly enriched uranium bomb. And then if you put the fuel in a reactor and irradiate it and then take it out and put it in a chemical separation plant called a reprocessing plant, you get plutonium, and then you have a plutonium bomb. Wow. But for a minute, getting back to this conference and the appeal of nuclear, it wasn't the industry, it wasn't the business end of it. It was that I sensed even then that there was this enormous secrecy surrounding everything. People were very reluctant to tell me anything. And there was also this sort of a feeling of zealotry. And I remember in particular this one man near Mr. Goldschmidt, whose name was incongruously Andre Petit, because he was very tall, who would wax on about plutonium, which I hardly understood what that was either. But the way he said plutonium, almost in religious tones, I was mesmerized. I would just sit there listening to him, waiting for him to pronounce it again so I could hear him say it. But I thought, what is this? And I thought I must be imagining it. But as more time went on, I realized that there really is a kind of mythical aspect to nuclear energy on both sides. There's a mythical aspect on the civilian side, with people thinking it was going to be the answer to all our problems. It was going to solve the world's energy problems. And on the weapons side, it's even more alluring. It's the power, it's the incontrovertible power that you will be the one that controls the world. This is what people sort of dreamed of. This is why Saddam Hussein did what he did. This is why Gaddafi did what he did, and why the North Koreans are making their people starve so they can have nuclear weapons. It's very, very powerful. So all of this becomes kind of, it becomes sort of magnetizing, not in a very good way, not in a very positive way, but you want to explore and you want to find out more. So this leads on to...
I interviewed somebody some years ago who knew Edward Teller.
Wow.
And who suggested that the whole Atoms for Peace thing came out of this wrenching guilt that these men felt who had been involved in the Manhattan Project because they had vaporized several 100,000 people in Japan, or the product of their work. And the only way that they felt they could redeem themselves, some consciously, some unconsciously, but this was the thread that seemed to run through it, was by using this technology to save lives, to create power that could power hospitals.
Yes.
Radiation in medicine, things like that. Is that your sense of it? And if so, has that been lost and it's just been turned into a business? And if so, has it been turned into a toxic business?
There's an element of that still. It's fed through the industry's, well, how they advertise themselves and how they put themselves forward. You still hear this, that it's clean energy, that it's going to save the...
Is it?
No. That's a myth. It's been created by more by advertising people. But the Atoms for Peace is more complicated than that. There definitely was guilt, and there was always a dream, by the way, going back to Marie Curie's time, that if you could tap into this energy, which really was an amazing discovery, you could have all these wonderful peaceful uses. They didn't really understand where you would go with this, but there was always the dream that this would be beneficial to mankind. And you know, there are a lot of well-meaning people, and always have been, in the nuclear industry.
It's kind of Icarus-like, though, isn't it?
It is. It is. And I say that with you know, some of them are, not all of them. But once the weapon, really the origins of Atoms for Peace under Eisenhower was a need to find a happy message to give the public while you increased your weapons stockpile. And it was really a PR campaign from top to bottom, where they got a man from Time Life who was in PSYOPs operations during the war. They fanned out to all the media and used it, you know, unabashedly to promote the idea of peaceful nuclear energy. And everything flowed from there. This is a very, very, and you know, by the way, all the language that you hear associated with so-called peaceful nuclear energy, it used to be, Oppenheimer called it either dangerous nuclear activities or safe, and he made a distinction. That wording was dropped for obvious reasons, and then now they go to peaceful,
right,
or you know.
I remember as a kid, the power company in Lansing, Michigan, you know, they had a nuke someplace in Michigan that they actually a couple of them, Fermi and one up in Charlottesville. And we were told, this was in the 50s and early 60s, we were told that eventually, within a decade or so, our electricity would be free. And every couple months, we'd gather up all the light bulbs in the house and take them down to the power company, and they'd exchange them for free. Wow. You know, give free light bulbs, because eventually electricity is going to be free. Yeah. And, you know, you need to use more electricity. And What happened to that? I mean, it's like...
I must say I never had that experience. Well, it certainly didn't prove too cheap to meter, and that quote, by the way, was it will one day, one day it will prove too cheap to meter. It's never proven too cheap to meter. In fact, now the reason that the Renaissance in the United States isn't taking off is partly because we have an abundance of natural gas, but it's just pricing itself out of the market.
Nuclear power.
Yeah, it's costing somewhere between $6 and $10 billion a plant, and you know, utility men are not stupid. They don't want. I mean, they understand there's a lot of hassle factor associated with nuclear energy. Some of them are still very much for it, and we do have one project proceeding in Georgia paid for by the ratepayers ahead of the plant being built.
Yeah.
But.
Slick way to cover the downside.
It didn't used to be allowed because you know they have no guarantee they will get the money back if the plant for some reason is never built and never produces any power. I mean, normally the way utilities operate is you don't pay ahead, you pay for what you get.
Yeah. And the Germans looked at this and they wanted not to build a couple more nuclear plants, and so they did the solar panel thing and thought, you know, let's generate a gigawatt or 2 gigawatts, a couple of nuclear power plants. They've generated 10 nuclear power plants worth of solar power now.
Exactly. The Germans, it's a very, very interesting situation going on in Europe. My colleague at NIW has just written about it this week, so I've just come fresh from editing his story. But Germany is not only very vociferously anti-nuclear in its own country, it's now pushing other countries around its borders to not do nuclear, including France and Poland and Czechoslovakia, and saying, you know, we're on your border. If you have an accident, we get hurt by this.
I lived there when Chernobyl happened.
Right, and you know, it isn't just about Fukushima. It's Fukushima plus Chernobyl, because the whole European landmass, and I was living in England at the time, got, you know, there were pockets, very high pockets all over Europe. When I wrote the book, the northwest of England still had farms under quarantine from Chernobyl. So this left a strong impression, I think, particularly the Germans.
Yeah, it's really quite remarkable, and you know how this, you know, well, let's talk about how this is going to play out.
Sure.
We'll be right back. After the break, more of tonight's Conversations with Great Minds with Stephanie Cooke.
We just put a picture of me when I was like 9 years old.